Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our first meetup of 2021, Data in the Greater Good. I'm Elaine Gamble, and I'm the community leader of Data in the Greater Good, where our community focus is the use of data in mission-driven organizations, philanthropy, the arts, social justice, education, among other areas. And we've had phenomenal speakers come and talk to us about how data has enabled them to achieve their vision. And we are very excited to welcome back tonight Nick Hamlin, data science at Global Giving. And Nick spoke with us exactly a year ago this month about the use of data and data transformation in their organization before the pandemic. And now he's here to talk to us about a perspective on data at Global Giving since the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot has happened since Global Giving was last featured here at Data in the Greater Good about a year ago. And in this return visit, Nick Hamlin will describe what it's been like to do social sector data world during a pandemic, what's had to change, how problems and systems have needed to evolve, what challenges remain the same as ever. We'll also discuss some of the key components of Global Giving's work in 2020, some COVID related, others not, and how Global Giving has kept data at the heart of its operations and programs, even in a fully remote world. And to tell you more about Nick Hamlin lives to make social good data accessible, understandable, and actionable for everyone. As Global Giving's first data scientist, he wears many hats, as you do when you're the first, including leading the organization's data strategy, building and maintaining core infrastructure, and designing experiments that evaluate program impact. He's also a data ambassador for DataKind practice in community health, the developer of Pando, Root Change's platform for exploring networks in the social sector. And most recently, he has appeared in 97 Things About Ethics Everyone in Data Science Should Know, O'Reilly Publishing 2020. In his past life, Nick worked as a reliability consulting engineer for Fortune 500 companies around the world. He's held positions with the National Science Foundation in China and Thailand. And outside of work, he's a folk music performer, an amateur coffee nerd, and a former worm farmer. So we're excited to have Nick here tonight to give his perspective on data Global Giving in these times. So in that note, Nick, I will turn it over to you. Welcome back to Data in the Greater Good.
Well, thanks so much, Elaine. I appreciate the kind intro, and thanks everyone for taking some time out of your Wednesday night to hang out with us. It's great to get to meet and chat with like-minded data folks who are working in the social sector in all kind of related realms. So Elaine's kind of given a little bit of an intro to me, but for those who are not familiar with Global Giving and the work that we do, a little bit of background. Global Giving is a nonprofit ourselves, and we work with other nonprofits all around the world to connect them to donors and companies. We have, since our inception, helped thousands of organizations, primarily smaller, primarily community-led, get access to money, information, ideas, support, networks, whatever it is our partners need to make the world a better place. That's what we want to be able to help them get access to. And what that looks like in terms of numbers, we've been around, like I say, since 2002, so about actually almost 20 years now at this point, which is a little wild. We've raised over $500 million from 1.2 million people just like you in support of almost 30,000 projects in just about every country in the world. We did recently, as in the last year or two, I believe, we had one penguin project in Antarctica, and we are now officially represented in all 7 continents, which is very exciting. And it really does run the gamut. Any kind of work that you can imagine someone doing to better their community, chances are good there is somebody on Global Giving doing that kind of work. This is everything from maternal health in India to kids in agriculture in Peru, One of my personal favorites is an organization that's based in Tanzania that trains giant African pouched rats to sniff out landmines. We also spend a lot of time doing disaster relief and response work and supporting our partners who are doing that, both here in the US and certainly all around the world. And just as a quick note, all of the imagery that you'll see in this deck tonight comes directly from our project partners. They really do some awesome work, and it's great to be able to share their imagery as broadly as we can. And so, as Elaine mentioned, just about a year ago, I had the pleasure of speaking with the Data for the Greater Good community, and I made the assertion, controversial or not, maybe, that effective data science in the social sector tends to much more resemble the act of playing folk music than it does the act of playing rock music. And I really dragged out and tortured this metaphor, where there's really not, kind of the one rock star standing on the stage with a bunch of technology pounding away at a killer guitar solo. It's much more collaborative. It's much more organic. And we kind of gave examples that fell into 4 different categories. These ideas of simplicity, collaboration, reinvention, and cause, which collectively, I believe, represent both some of the characteristics that make the best folk music and characteristics that make some of the best data work, particularly in social good organizations. There's a great recording. Bill put together an awesome video of it. We can make that link available if you're interested. I'm not going to sing that song again tonight. Instead, I gave this talk in, I believe it was like mid to late February, up in New York. And then I took the Amtrak back home here to DC. And I basically haven't left home since, because like a week or 2 after I returned, the pandemic happened. And this was a huge change for everybody. Like everybody has said that so often that it truly is almost a cliche. I'm sure all of you on the call have felt this as well. Personally and professionally, just a huge sea change in how we think, how we live, how we work. And there's 2 particular things that made this really tricky for us. One was, as I said, at Global Giving, we're used to doing, or not so much direct response, but supporting all of our partners who are doing both rapid disaster response, as well as, sometimes years-long disaster recovery processes. That's not new for us. What was new for us is that this was the first time we had a major disaster event that the entire team was both responding to at work, but also were directly affected by ourselves. My wife's a healthcare worker. Many of our friends have been, or many of our colleagues at Global Giving have had family and friends affected by COVID. It's impossible to avoid. And that was a really big difference. We've never had a situation. We've had situations in the past where individual people, our staff in India affected by flooding in Kerala, people who were based in New York affected by Hurricane Sandy, one-offs here and there. But this is the first time it's really hit 100% of the team. It's also the first time that we've been forced to work 100% remotely. We've been used to connecting globally. We have partners and staff based all around the world. People are moving around. So that isn't new. But normally about half, maybe more of us are working physically in person in our main office here in DC. And so having this moment of everything is now fully decentralized and fully online, that was really tricky. And so in reflecting on this kind of past year of doing data work in this new context, I was thinking again about those 4 categories: this simplicity, collaboration, reinvention, and cause. And I realized that those themes have kept popping up even through this really weird year. And so I thought what I would do tonight is tell a couple quick stories about how these, folk music, social sector, data science underpinnings have continued to pop up as we have sought to continue our operations, support our partners, and importantly, also maintain the data culture that we've worked really hard to build at Global Giving through this generational health and economic crisis. So with that, first up, I have simplicity. As particularly kind of early March into April, we had this feeling of the runaway train, a lot of things changing really rapidly. And I'll give a couple more examples in a few minutes. But one thing that was consistent about all of these was that things were changing and we needed to make sure that we could operate without breaking stuff. So for example, it became very clear that we needed to update the list of project themes on the Global Giving website. If you go to globalgiving.org, you can see there's all kinds of categories of projects broken out there. If you want to go and support education or healthcare, women and girls, there's something for everybody. But that taxonomy that people use really matters. And so one obvious thing was, we've got so many organizations responding to COVID now. We should probably add a COVID theme explicitly to make it very easy to find these kinds of projects. We also realized that it made sense to take other categories that were kind of too broad and split them apart. Places that needed updated language, where the ways that we talk about an issue have evolved. And so that's kind of change that has the potential to break a lot of analytics that have previously existed. One of the things that I love about the data culture at Global Giving is that pretty much everybody on staff is able to ask and answer questions directly via an analytics tool we have called Metabase. Not everything flows through me or flows through our product team. And this is great because we're able to take people who have, deep knowledge of our nonprofit partners or our corporate partners or our operations, vetting and grant making, whatever it is, the people with the best knowledge of the problem can get directly onto the data, generally pretty deeply. But this means that it's impossible for me to easily know what would happen if we make a change. Will that break all of these other analyses and dashboards and things that other people on the team have made? And so, put another way, we needed to ensure that we were avoiding the possibility for making major mistakes, much more so than worrying about being 100% perfect when we make these rapid changes. And so I love this quote by Phil Birnbaum, who's a baseball guy, talks about how analytics is actually really good at helping you filter out stupidity. So what we did, the change that we made, or a major change that we made to help defend against this, was putting analytics on our analytics. So what this is here, I mentioned we use a tool called Metabase. This is a screenshot from Metabase here. And what Metabase does is when people use it to ask questions and save them, it writes information to a database. What Metabase doesn't normally do, unless you connect it up, which is what we did, was we took that database and added it as a data source. So we kind of got this inception thing going here where we got metabase. And so what this allows us to do is to say, well, who's asking what questions? What questions are getting traffic? When we have a question featured on a dashboard or on an automated email, what dependencies exist? For whom? Who's downloading the data? All this really, really rich metadata about the analytics work that we're doing, so that when we go to say, we're going to change up the way something like our project themes work, we can map actually pretty rigorously the ripple effects of that change, and then have a conversation about, okay, should we put this on? Do we need to slow down a little bit and put some guardrails in place and fix stuff up before we deploy? Or are we comfortable moving forward and, putting some, at least bounding the potential downside, guarding against something really bad happening? Being able to have that conversation in concrete terms was hugely beneficial when we were trying to move quickly. So keeping it simple, not making stupid mistakes, I think was core to our ability to iterate, particularly when we needed to be very responsive to changing conditions. The next kind of natural area that was really important was this idea of collaboration. And as I said, we were used to working in an office that was, typical open office, big room, lots of desks and rows and things. And so all the time there's this, hey, can you come take a look at this thing that I'm working on and troubleshoot this problem, help me think through this analysis, tell me about the history of this weird data point. That happens in person, where you walk up to somebody's desk or you run into them in the break room, you're having a cup of coffee and you spend 10 minutes talking it out. That doesn't happen in a fully remote environment unless we invest the time and the effort and the energy to create the conditions where it can happen. That was one thing that was really important. Another thing that was really important is that people were under, and still are, under a lot of stress. And what human brains do when they're under a lot of stress is they revert to the things that are familiar, the things that are in muscle memory. And this is why first responders train the way they do, so that when they are, fighting a fire and the building is literally burning down around them, they know where that oxygen mask is. They know where their axe is. It's all just baked in there. They don't have to worry about thinking through the detailed technical steps of how to solve a problem when the cortisol's flowing. And so what we found was that even when we have this very broad data culture where a lot of people are, in some cases taking steps outside their technical comfort zone to engage with a topic, that's one of those areas that when they're under stress starts to become really tricky, because it does require some of that, more logical thinking instead of that inbound muscle memory response. And so we noticed that there were gaps starting to open that we needed to fill. So a couple things that we did. One was to start to create some alternate resources that people could use to answer questions, both to allow for kind of more bite size, oh my gosh, I don't remember how to do this thing. How can I get that answer quickly when I'm stressed out? Fill that kind of small immediate need. And also for questions that were very common that would maybe have been answered in the break room in the past, figure out alternative ways to speak to those. So one thing we did was we experimented with videos, which I think are probably the closest way we've been able to replicate that, hey, can you come look at this interaction? The trade-off there is that they look really great and you can get them really tailored, but that's really labor intensive and time consuming. And so mixed results on the videos. We're just now kind of getting back into it. What we've found to be more effective is the idea of self-documenting processes. We need to have more and more things kind of written down and searchable, but documentation takes a lot of time. And so whenever possible, if we are able to tweak our workflows such that they naturally spin off written artifacts that at least can form the basis for more involved documentation, that's a really good thing. So we added a Slack channel, for example, where people could come and ask data questions, and myself and other folks would be kind of on calls right there in the same way that we would if we were at our desks. And that again contributes to that in-person collaboration feeling a little bit, but it also, now those interactions are being held in a public forum where they can be searched and they can be referenced, they can be linked to in other places. And so even if it's a little unstructured, that's a really valuable self-documenting process, collaborative process. We also realized that it was important to take some time to write down the unwritten rules. This was especially important because we were fortunate enough to actually add a new full-time data person to the team a couple months ago. And so a lot of kind of conventions about how we do things, how we structure our projects, how we comment our code, that's specific to data. We had some stuff around that, but it was not as codified as it could have been and needed to be. So pausing to invest the time to create that kind of meta documentation. The screenshot here is from a document called Global Giving Data Team, How We Work. That's been really valuable. Another thing that has worked out really well, and props to Kevin Conroy, our Chief Product Officer, for coming up with this idea, is pair learning. Pair learning is very simple. The way it works is that every month, everybody on the team gets randomly paired up with someone else on the team. And you have at some point in the month, you have 2 meetings that are about an hour each, where person A teaches person B something that they know about and that they are interested in, and then vice versa. And the only rules are that it must yield documentation in some form, whether that's in a repository, in a Google Doc, it doesn't really matter as long as it's somewhere. If you don't have documentation you can point someone to as a result of having this conversation, the conversation didn't happen, doesn't count. But beyond that, the process is flexible. And so because there's no structure around what you have to teach the other person, we've been able to both have some really generative conversations about things that we definitely wouldn't have talked about otherwise, and create these, again, self-documenting collaborative processes that now, if Elaine and I are paired together to have our pair learning conversations one month, we create documentation that then Bill can read. And so we're actually all able to learn on the fly rather than just this pairwise learning. It's been really effective. And we're now actually, originally we'd just done this within our product team. Now we're starting to expand it to cross-team relationships. And TBD kind of how that collaboration goes, but definitely collaboration has been front of mind for us throughout the pandemic and will continue to be. The third category that I want to speak to is reinvention. And I'm sure for you all as well, certainly for us, there have been plenty of situations over the last year when we've needed to take something that we had been doing for a while and totally reinvent it to meet some new need. And the story I want to tell about this is about the Red Backpack Fund, which is a project that we did in collaboration with Spanx. As you may know, Sarah Blakely is the founder of Spanx, and she started the company with a $5,000 seed capital investment and her so-called lucky red backpack that she took to all of her investor meetings. And when the pandemic hit, through her foundation, Sarah Blakely wanted to kind of pay that favor forward by making a series of $5,000 grants to at least 1,000 women entrepreneurs who, like her, were trying to make their business work, but who at that moment in time were really struggling during the pandemic. And so Spanx and Sarah partnered with Global Giving to make all of this happen. And pulling this off on the timeline that we needed to pull it off really required some serious reinvention of strategy, process, and also like data structures. There's a couple major contributors to why this was such a reinvention opportunity. One is that we do a lot of grant making. These are either grant making in the context of disaster responses or as part of corporate partnerships, but they are usually very focused on nonprofits. And while these programs can be pretty complicated, scale-wise, we're usually talking about hundreds of potential grantees at most. And so we have a set of tools that the team has built over the years to administer these programs in-house, end to end, all the way from people applying for the grants to being vetted, to dispersing the money, to then reporting on the grants and follow-up. That's what we're used to. The Red Backpack Fund was very different in a couple of key ways. One is that instead of nonprofits, now we are primarily working with businesses. Nonprofits were eligible for this, but they were a minority of both applications and grantees. And so dealing with for-profit businesses work quite differently, all the way around, everything from the kinds of data that you have to collect about them, to the kinds of questions you would want to ask, to the kinds of domain expertise you need on your grant-making team to be able to make responsible grants. So that was a big change. Another big change was scale. We ended up needing to design a system, in about a couple of days, really, that could support tens of thousands of applicants rather than the typical, couple hundred that we were used to dealing with. And so crucially, that had another implication, which meant that we were kind of expanding what we're thinking about here from a grant making problem. And when I use that term, I'm talking about facilitating grants based on the grant proposals and vetting of organizations, where most people who apply are probably going to be awarded a grant, to this idea of moderation, where you have a much, much larger pool of applicants that you need to winnow down based on potentially a set of value judgments before you even start getting into the process of vetting an organization. This is a totally different problem. And it's one we had to, like I say, turn around very quickly. So there was not any time to kind of build that entirely new process from the ground up alongside our existing code base. So from my end, from a data perspective, we needed to really thread that needle between functionality and speed, but also flexibility, because the scope of what we were trying to do was still evolving as we were building the system. And so to deal with that, we used as many off-the-shelf solutions as we could, and connected them kind of very tactically to the core systems that we already had via API and, to be honest, a lot of kind of Python glue code. One important, oh. Sorry about that. Can you still hear me? I'm not used to talking with wired headphones and gesturing wildly and pulling wires out.
I can hear you perfectly.
Okay, great. Anyway, Airtable is a tool you may have heard of, and I was formed a key component of this stack. If you're not familiar with Airtable, it's kind of this Frankenstein between a spreadsheet and a database. So it looks like a spreadsheet, it acts like a spreadsheet in a lot of ways, and people who are used to thinking in Excel and Google Sheets can engage with it very easily. It's very intuitive if you're thinking in those terms. Unlike a spreadsheet, if you have an Excel sheet, the storage of the data in each cell is the same as the representation of the data. And so if you want to represent that data in a different way, like on a different tab in the spreadsheet, you're literally making a second copy of the data. And so it's very easy to inadvertently mess up the underlying data when you want to change the representation. Maybe you filter it and you don't, only filter the one column and not the other, and now you've essentially shuffled your deck of cards. It's very easy to make those kinds of errors. And so Airtable gets around that problem because on the back end, it actually is a database. It just has this kind of spreadsheet-like front end. And so that worked really well to allow us that level of flexibility without worrying as much about structure, particularly as we started to see the scale up. At the same time, if I were going to go back and do this again, I think Airtable was kind of a right place, right time tool, in that it allowed us, it was like the 80% option, allowed us to get what we needed, got the project done, but it definitely was not without some speed bumps, particularly in terms of making sure that everything, those API integrations worked the way we needed them to work. We get data where we needed to have it when we needed it there. There's always opportunities for improvement, particularly given the speed at which we were trying to work. But at the same time, I think for what it was, it did meet that need pretty well. And at the end of the day, this project ended up being very successful in terms of, we were able to get 1,080 grants out to deserving women entrepreneurs across the US. Just about all 50 states were represented over the span of, I think, just shy of 5 months. And importantly, the vast majority of these went to people who were this is like stuff to keep the lights on. This is the hair salon that's not able to see in-person customers because the public health lockdown is in effect. These are the coffee shop owners who are at best doing delivery or takeout. The need here was really big, and it was an honor to be able to help meet that. And so the last story I want to tell, I'm conscious of the clock here, is about cause. And I thought I would wrap up with a project that kind of brings all 4 of these themes together, and it really is one of my favorite projects that we've done over the last year. As I said, we do plenty of our traditional disaster response work involves us posting a project, we have a traditional coronavirus relief fund where people could donate, and we would then use that pool of money to deploy to partners around the world who were doing different aspects of COVID response. But we also realized that there were a lot of our partners who, even though they weren't necessarily doing direct COVID response, were really facing a lot of hardship in the same way that the Women in the Red Backpack Fund were. And so as a result, we implemented what we call our COVID Hardship Microgrants Initiative. First of all, this was very simple. There's our first theme. Any organization that was part of the global giving community in good standing could apply for one of these funds. All they had to do was tell us who they were, and in 3 sentences or less, this is important, what they needed the money for. That is the extent of the application for this grant. It was very short, and our program team would read through these and choose as many of them as we could to receive $1,000 of unrestricted support right away. There's no additional work, no follow-up, no questions asked. They can spend that money however they see fit. And so this requires a lot of collaboration, there's our second theme, internally, but also collaboration externally. This kind of program doesn't work without a lot of trust. And this idea of trust-based grant making is really at the core of what we do. It requires a lot of reinvention as well, because most grant programs don't really work this way. This is one that is this distilled around the idea of trust-based grant making is a bit new. And so we had to make sure that, particularly, again, given the timelines, this need was urgent. We were working really fast. We had to make sure we could reinvent the systems that we needed to do to deliver. And it also speaks to the cause that's most central to our mission, which is community-led change. This is our chance to really, in a time of great need, let our community lead the way. And so the response to this was very positive. And people particularly reacted to this. The idea, trust-based grant making has been around for a while, but people really responded to this extreme an example of it, where this Amy Stokes is one of the recipients of microgrant, and she called out very well, it allows us to respond exactly where our need is without spending a bunch of extra time nitpicking in a grant application or worrying about a report. That's really valuable. Another side effect of this, and I haven't really gotten too much into the technical data science weeds in this talk so far. It's probably my most technical slide. But an important side effect of this work is that it gave us a window into the operational needs of these organizations and how they were changing, what they were struggling with, without putting an additional burden on them. We didn't have to go to them and say, hey, would you fill out this 20-page survey telling us about your needs during the pandemic? Instead, we were able to take those 3-sentence blurbs and do a little natural language processing to see what kinds of patterns emerge. And sure enough, we did start to see some patterns. So what you're looking at here is a representation of the latent Dirichlet analysis, if you're into the NLP buzzwords. But basically, visualizing the clumps of microgrant application. And what we saw were kind of 3 big categories. The smallest one were organizations who wanted funds to, even if they were not public health organizations in the past, everyone was a public health organization now. So these were organizations that said, hey, I want to be able to set up I want to buy hand sanitizer for the people that I serve, or I want to set up hand washing PR campaigns so that people know how they need to do this, they know how to do it right. Another category that we saw was what I have described as nonprofit needs. These were organizations that would say things like, our major fundraiser for each year is an in-person gala, and we can't do that anymore, and we don't know how we're going to raise money to keep paying our staff. Or we're all working from home and our CFO needs a laptop because the only way they have to access the books is through the desktop computer that was in our office, which is now closed. Then the third kind of very broad category was kind of everything else, which I generally speaks to other vulnerable populations being affected by the pandemic. And so you see things in there where it's like, oh, we there's a lot of talk about food security. For example, most people in our school get lunch through school, and our school is closed now, so we need to deliver lunches. Or there was a lot of specifically talking about worrying about other vulnerable populations in communities, particularly the elderly, women and girls, people with pre-existing conditions, people with disabilities, lots of different manifestations, which made it really hard to kind of draw a clear line around this. Not that would even have really been helpful. And so all of that's really useful, because then as we are thinking about our longer term response, both programmatically, in terms of what programs we might offer to support our partners and what kinds of grant making we might do, we're able to take the results of analyses like these and use that to inform those programs, again, without placing that extra burden on our partners. So this was, like I say, one of my favorite projects that we did last year, of several that were really appealing. And so just to wrap up, after nearly a year of doing this, we're certainly still at it. Last year was actually the largest year of activity ever on Global Giving. We, for the first time, crossed the $100 million mark flowing through the community within the calendar year, which was really exciting. And looking ahead to 2021, I have no doubt that the ideas of simplicity, collaboration, reinvention, and cause will continue to appear in the data work that we're doing and everything that we're planning. And so thought I'd close with this one excerpt from a note that one of the recipients of the microgrants sent us. This is from Sister Rebecca, who runs several programs for people with disabilities in Matagalpa, Nicaragua. And it really struck me because it's such a poetic way to capture how it has felt, I think, certainly for me, and I imagine for many others, both to live and to do this kind of work at this time in history. And so, from my small corner of the suffering planet, again, thank you all for taking your Wednesday evening to hang out with us. And so at this point, I would be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Nick, thanks so much for another very inspiring talk about how you've evolved, how you've pivoted during these times. Very, very exciting. Love the wisdom. The first question, how have these COVID times impacted the donation levels that you've seen? Have you seen consistency in the amount of donations, fewer donations, but higher amount, a hybrid? But just how has COVID impacted your donor base, and what impact, if any, did it have on the decisions you had to make regarding grants?
That's a great question. Two things I'll mention in there. One is that I think a notable, I have been using the term disaster and disaster response to describe our work around COVID. And it certainly is, but it's definitely different, particularly when you contrast it with what I would maybe describe as more traditional disaster response. So for example, in 2017, we had a string of major disaster events, all back to back to back. There was Hurricane Harvey, Hurricane Irma, Hurricane Maria, and then the earthquake in Mexico. And those kind of all acted similarly in that there were a lot of individual, what I would call retail donations. These are people like you and me coming to the website saying, I want to help. We certainly had plenty of that with COVID as well. But COVID, I think, also has slipped more, there's been more corporate activity as well. And I don't necessarily want to make any claims about why that is. I think if I had to speculate, disclaimer, speculation, it's plausible to imagine that, we are all affected by this in ways that maybe we weren't all affected by other disasters coming into play. It's also, I think, really reasonable to speculate that individuals, particularly given the economic crunch being felt, are, maybe have less discretionary funds to throw around. We've not really done any deep analysis of that aspect, but certainly we have seen, a bit of a shift there. But overall, like I say, the amount of activity is up. And people continue to be very generous and very supportive of the work of all the nonprofits on our platform. And that brings me to the other point that I'll make. I've been talking, actually, I'm realizing just now as I say this, as a result of kind of that bit more of that corporate shift, a lot of the stories I've told tonight have been kind of about more traditional grant making. We also still have what is a crowdfunding platform, essentially, where people are able to go and choose a project on the site, say, I want to donate $10, $20, whatever, to that project, and it goes straight to that project. There's no grant making involved. And so that remains a really rich, active part of the community, which is that. And actually, that's typically the side of the coin that I usually wind up talking about. This is a bit of a different angle. But because organizations are able to post projects, for whatever work they are doing, they have control over how they describe their work and how they make that ask. As I said, we're all kind of public health organizations now. So many organizations have expanded their remit, have shifted their programs. And so you see what can be described as COVID giving kind of creeping into other themes. That's why that's another reason why the question about themes that we talked about at the beginning comes up a lot. It's very difficult to draw clear lines in the sand and say, this organization's doing that work and this organization's doing that work, especially in a pandemic. And so all it is to say, yes, giving is up. People continue to be really supportive, and we're very thankful.
Mhm. Next question. In having a more seamless or streamlined process for applications, do you feel you're establishing a new normal for grant application and perhaps a new standard that could in some ways hurt you once we are past COVID and that people become accustomed to that process and won't want to go back to the more thorough approach to applying for grants? Do you see it hurting you longer term?
No, I don't see it hurting us longer term. I think we, like all other organizations that are supporting the social sector through COVID and into the future, will need to be very mindful of how we think about this kind of thing. And maybe the way I would reframe that is to say, I do think that we are, and quite intentionally, really leaning into the idea of trust and trust-based grant making. One thing that Global Giving spends a ton of time thinking about is how can we create trust in organizations that would maybe struggle to be trusted otherwise. For example, if you are based in the US and are a 501c3, to a US donor market, there is some recognition for the concept of what a 501c3 means and the implications that you can trust that organization has been vetted by the IRS. And then people sometimes like to take that a step further and they go to a site like Charity Navigator, great site, and look up some information about those organizations. They're building trust. Imagine now, though, that you are a small, actually, here's a good example. Imagine now that your sister Rebecca in Matagalpa, Nicaragua, who is running these programs and programs that are phenomenal and I think speak to the philanthropic goals of many people, but she's based in Nicaragua. She's not registered in the US. She's not a 501c3. Her internet's not even great. She doesn't have a marketing team. The notion that someone in the US would not only know about her, but would trust her with their money, absent some of those other trust signals, is a real challenge. And so Global Giving seeks to help bridge that gap and help create that trust with those kinds of organizations. And so when it comes to grant making, I think we are very much about thinking creatively about how we can lean into this idea of trust-based grant making. That doesn't necessarily mean that every grant application has to be 3 sentences long, full stop. There are plenty of situations where it makes good sense and is appropriate to have more involved grant programs. The majority of our applications are, but it's about being mindful and being responsive. I'll give you another example. Another thing that we did with our other more traditional grant programs when the pandemic began was reach out to the people who were already in them and had already gotten grants and say, hey, we're here for you. If you need to push out a reporting deadline because you're focused on responding to the pandemic and making sure your staff is safe, let's talk. We can make that happen. If you need to, what you had originally applied for that grant to do, now your programs have shifted a little bit because we're all public health organizations now. Let's talk. We can find a way to do that responsively and maintain that trust while still being mindful, while still being flexible. And I think that's really what we're driving for, more so than a grant application must look like this.
How big is the analytics team at Global Giving? How do you work with your team members and what collaboration tools do you use?
It's a great question. So the way I describe it is that there's this idea that there's data people and there's not data people. And I think that is false. As I said, our data culture is very decentralized. And so we really strive to get as much data as we can into the hands of as many people across the staff as we can. And so the way I talk about it is there are now, as of a couple months ago, 2 people on staff, you are looking at half of them, that have the word data in their full-time job title. But there are lots of other people at Global Giving that are doing data adjacent work, in some cases very directly. On our product team, we have people, our systems architect who supports kind of DevOps type questions, networking types of questions. We have people on our product management side who are thinking really deeply about what are the data products that need to get integrated with the offerings that we make. Our operations team does a ton of stuff with data, and so it really does permeate the whole team. But if you're going to, capital A analytics team, it's me and our data analyst. And so in terms of tools and things that we use, for collaboration, I mean, a lot of, like I said, a lot of Slack, a lot of Google Doc, a lot of Zoom, especially these days. Our predominant, we're predominantly a Python shop. Every now and then I'll dip into R for something that is really stats heavy or is going to need to be R Markdown or something like that. But mostly it's Python. Let's see. I mean, Jupyter Notebooks, VS Code, those kinds of things. I'm happy to talk more about that if there's interest, but let me pause there.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the fact that pairing has been a key way to enable learning within Global Giving. When has it not worked in Global Giving? And what about your culture gave you a foundation for success in that, as it may not work for everyone?
Yeah, two thoughts on that. One is it's not, certainly this would count, but it's not pairing in the traditional like pair programming sense. One could do that, and I'm sure that would be interesting, but that's not what we're talking about here. More what we're talking about is it's less structured, it's less formal. It's much more like, hey, let's get a coffee and you can tell me about that cool project that you're working on. But while we're doing that, I'm going to type and take some notes, and we're going to then spend some time cleaning that up and make that into something that people can read. So that's one distinction. And we've only really been doing this particular kind of pair learning for, I want to say, since like July. We're not even a full year into it. So the jury is still out on the ways that it might fail. I'm sure we will find more. But I would say, one thing where it has started to, where we have noticed the opportunities for improvement are, we aren't a huge team. And so if it's pairwise matches once a month, fairly quickly you run out of matches. And, people are still working on stuff. And so if you wind up getting paired with the same person twice, it's not the end of the world. You're going to have different things to talk about. But that can get a little stale. And so that's one reason why we are starting to branch out to say, all right, what would this look like to do it across teams? Another variation that we are considering is tentatively named tandem speed documentation, where two people, instead of I know about a thing and you know about a thing, but we know about different things and we're going to teach each other, tandem speed documentation is two people who know about the same thing, both hop into a Google document and set a timer and see how much they can document about that thing in like 15 or 20 minutes. And I know that sounds ridiculous and boring and stupid. I personally have found it to be shockingly effective, the handful of times that I've done it. I don't know if everybody on our team shares that same belief, but I think definitely there will be opportunities to iterate. We're going to need to continue to tweak it. And we'll see how it goes. It's worked so far, but it'll be interesting to see where it lands.
And one last question, or next to the last question, do you feel your name, Global Giving, can evoke images of elitism with some, such that they might feel what might be a modest gift would not be acceptable to you?
Oh, that's really interesting. I could imagine that being plausible, but I have not encountered, I personally have not encountered any evidence of it, and I am not aware of others on the team having shared evidence of that. I think part of what makes Global Give, part of what has contributed, what may be contributing to that actually, since I don't know for sure, but what may be contributing to that is that from day one, Global Giving has been about the idea of bottom-up philanthropy. It is very vocally not about the idea of someone giving a huge gift to a huge organization. To the contrary, it's about regular people like you and me supporting small, trusted, community-led organizations, usually in, our our median donation size is $25. Like these are not large donations for the most part. Certainly, we would happily accept large donations, and we do, particularly in the context of corporate relationships. But even then, many of those corporate relationships, for example, are around like gift cards. So a company might say, instead of, we're not going to have a holiday party. This happened a lot. We're not going to have a holiday party this year. Instead, we're going to send everybody a $20 gift card to pick out a project on global giving that speaks to them and have them allocate that money. That's at an individual level, a really small thing. But the sum total of all those things, when they're spread across a platform of organizations like ours, amounts to really substantial change. And so that $100 million that I mentioned, yeah, it's a lot of money, but it represents the collective generosity of thousands of people. And I think that's really what we're about, this idea of taking philanthropy and turning it from what has historically been a very top-down, we have a lot of money and we're going to give it to you mindset, to what can we all do collectively, even if that's in $10 increments.
Mm-hmm. And last question, could you please provide some examples of pair learning topics?
Oh, sure. So I actually had one of these meetings about 5 hours ago, and it was about a new feature that had been built. One of our developers, actually a team of our developers, has been creating a new, you heard it here first, campaign hub for our program team to better administer campaigns for our nonprofit partners. And when I say campaigns, these are things like matching days or onboarding campaigns, where we invite new organizations onto the site to have a chance to test drive it. They take all manner of different forms. Usually they involve some kind of matching money and some kind of structured, fundraising component. And so she had just built, they're about to release this new feature, and she and I were talking about, she was teaching me about that feature, because I've not been involved in its creation. It was really interesting to kind of hear how it works, what the challenges were, what gaps it seeks to fill, all that kind of stuff. And then I was talking to her about the data pipelines the data pipelines around the campaigns that currently exist, so that we could identify, hey, what kinds of changes or improvements might we want to make to the data that is available about our campaigns that is now newly enabled by this feature. That's one example. But it truly runs the gamut. It can be everything from, I've done others about the Red Backpack Fund and the infrastructure underpinning that, with one of the other developers who builds a lot of those custom vetting and grant making tools. And so it was really interesting to kind of teach him about, here's this stuff we've had to do really rapidly to meet this need, and have him kind of come at it from the perspective of, how might we in the future start to, or should we at all, should we, not will we, integrate some of that stuff into the core product. It's really all over the place. And I think that's why it's been so helpful.
Okay, so that concludes our program for tonight. Nick, thank you again so much for inspiring us again virtually. Again, we'd love to have you back sometime in the future as well. We appreciate the opportunity to stay connected to you. And more information on our next meetup to follow, I will be in touch with you. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thanks, everybody.